I write about the issues that are facing forensic science on a national level from this national perspective, but it's wrapped in a story about Houston. It's a story about a man named George Rodriguez and the transformation of the HPD crime lab. So just to give you a little bit of background about George's case, he was convicted of a 1987 rape that occurred in the Denver Harbor area of Houston. And his conviction was based on erroneous eyewitness identification testimony by the victim, as well as incorrect testimony by two separate analysts of the HPD crime lab who had done testing on 3 different kinds of biological evidence. And not only did they testify that the biological evidence recovered from the victim was consistent with the samples taken from George Rodriguez, they also said that their testing excluded the true perpetrator, another person who had been investigated named Isidro Yanez. So they got it wrong on both accounts. And while the eyewitness testimony might have been effectively challenged, there's simply no way, especially back in 1987, there was just no way, even for a good criminal defense lawyer, to challenge the testimony of 2 separate crime lab analysts who say that the evidence fits, this points to this person. And so George Rodriguez was wrongly convicted, and he would spend the next 17 years in prison before finally being exonerated by DNA evidence in 2004. And it's a common story that we've heard, but I try to really get into the fine details of what this conviction did to him, to his family, what conditions were like for him over the course of that time, and that sort of stuff. So I want to read a little bit to you about the aftermath of Rodriguez's exoneration and how this case led to the decision to make the HPD crime lab independent. So here it goes. After his conviction for rape and kidnapping was set aside by the courts, Rodriguez sued the city of Houston in federal court in 2009 for violating his civil rights. This suit claimed that the police chief had shown deliberate indifference to the lack of training and supervision in the crime laboratory, and this had allowed for demonstrably false serology testimony to be given against him by the chief of the crime laboratory serology section. Barry Scheck argued the case before a jury of 5 women and 3 men. In his opening statement, Scheck told the jury of the loneliness, fear, and depression Rodriguez felt after his wrongful conviction and punishment. The jury heard testimony from former Mayor Lee P. Brown, who had been police chief in 1987 when Rodriguez was convicted, as well as from James Boulding, the crime laboratory manager, whose testimony landed Rodriguez behind bars. Rodriguez himself also testified. Robert Cambrese, an attorney for the city, blamed the debacle on bad lawyering by the Harris County prosecutor and by Rodriguez's first defense lawyer. On June 23, 2009, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. The group then sent a note to Federal District Judge Vanessa Gilmore informing her that they had reached an impasse on whether Police Chief Lee P. Brown had been deliberately indifferent to the lack of training and supervision of the crime laboratory staff. The fact that they had reached this question meant that the jury had already agreed that Boulding's testimony played a substantial role in Rodriguez's conviction, and that the city allowed the crime laboratory personnel to be inadequately trained and supervised. Judge Gilmore ordered the jury to resume deliberations the following day. If they found that the police chief had been deliberately indifferent, then the last issue they would have to address was whether the laboratory was the, quote, moving force behind the conviction. If they found that invalid scientific testimony was the moving force, then the city would be required to pay Rodriguez compensation for the violation of his civil rights. After a second day of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict in Rodriguez's favor. the crime laboratory analyst's testimony had been the moving force that caused Rodriguez's wrongful conviction. On Rodriguez's behalf, Scheck asked the jury to award $35 million in compensation, approximately $2 million for each year he had spent behind bars. What was taken away from him was his youth, Scheck told the jury. The jury awarded him $5 million. Pleased with the verdict, Rodriguez nonetheless lamented, "Ain't no amount of money is gonna even my scale. I lost my dad and my girls have been through hell. I am grateful for the jury verdict, but no money can replace what I've lost." Similar lawsuits have been filed around the country by exonerated men, and multi-million-dollar verdicts are the norm. 29 states and the District of Columbia also now have compensation statutes that allow exonerated individuals to apply for compensation rather than sue the government. Texas now has the most generous compensation package for exonerees in the nation. But this program came into effect after Rodriguez's lawsuit. Not only do wrongful convictions harm innocent individuals and their families, but they also put the community at continuing risk and cost the taxpayers millions. Despite the jury verdict, by 2011, Rodriguez had still not received a dime from the city. The city appealed the jury's decision, dragging out the litigation, disputing the judgment on liability on various legal grounds. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals sent the case back to Judge Gilmore's court on June 13, 2011, for another round of legal wrangling. Meanwhile, negotiations between the city and Rodriguez had been ongoing. Finally, 25 years after his arrest, the parties settled a case for $3.1 million late the following year. On November 2, 2012, Houston Mayor Annise Parker appeared at a press conference in City Hall. Flanked by George Rodriguez and his family members, on behalf of the city that had done him wrong, she publicly apologized to him. "Anyone with any compassion has to offer a heartfelt apology," said the mayor. In the aftermath of the Rodriguez conviction debacle and several other cases like it, Houston leaders grappled with a complex problem. How could separate crime lab analysts at the Houston Police Department Crime Laboratory give incorrect scientific evidence of 3 different types against Rodriguez? Were they lying, honestly mistaken, or incompetent? Of James Boulding, who in 2004 was head of the DNA unit, the Innocence Project's lawyer Mark Warrow told the Houston Chronicle, "Our experts don't know whether he was lying or completely incompetent." State District Judge Jan Crocker ruled that there was probable cause to believe that Boulding had committed aggravated perjury in a separate 2002 sexual assault trial, and a special court of inquiry was convened. Boulding had interpreted similar scientific evidence in opposite ways in 2 separate rape cases, each time in ways that supported the prosecution's case. However, the charge against Boulding was later dismissed because the statute of limitations on the perjury offense had expired. What had become clear is that the crime laboratory had serious problems. The state audit uncovered a dysfunctional organization with untrained staff, contamination problems, and shoddy science. HPD shuttered the DNA unit after discovering that it had, quote, operated for years without a supervisor, overseen by a technical leader who had no personal experience performing DNA analysis and who was lacking the qualifications required under the FBI standards, staffed by underpaid and undertrained analysts and generating mistake-ridden and poorly documented casework, end quote. As law professor Paul Gianelli describes it, The HPD crime laboratory in the early 2000s was a paradigmatic example of a failed forensic agency. He quotes one state senator who expressed concerns that the validity of almost any case that has relied upon evidence produced by the laboratory is questionable. The worst of the nightmare was over for George Rodriguez, but cases like his had exposed the hidden truth about the deep problems lurking in many police crime laboratories. False, misleading, and exaggerated forensic testimony too often wreaked havoc on the innocent. For Houston and for so many other cities and states, the efforts to understand the root causes of a dysfunctional police crime laboratory, and more importantly, to identify the solutions, were only beginning.